I'm incredibly flattered by the turnout. I did not expect this large a crowd because really I'm just going to talk about hats. But I'm much more serious than you think I am. But just since I am going to be talking about hats, how many people here actually like hats? Can I just get a show of hands? Like if you have like, oh, do you like my hat? Yeah, fishing for a compliment. Louder? You can't hear me? Really? This is the first time somebody told me they couldn't hear me. My parents to this day claim I just don't have an indoor voice, but apparently I do when I'm really terrified. All right, well, the technology here is on a shoestring. I'm projecting a portion of my screen by using a secondary video stream, so if any of this crashes at some point, I'm sorry. I've prepared a series of drawings that wouldn't be practical to draw live in front of you, so I'm just going to reveal them as if I'm drawing them, but it's completely fake, and it's so obvious that it's fake, so I'm just going to do this. So the talk is The Many Hats of the Front-End Engineers, and it's by me. That's me. And you see that the reason I'm talking about hats is I kind of really love hats. They have many uses. They protect you against the elements, and those are the elements right there. They show off my keen fashion sense sometimes. They cover up the rapidly disappearing hairline, which you can't see. See, it's right there. And they also serve as a protection from the projectiles thrown by the angry audience as soon as they find out, is just to talk about hats. And I think most importantly, the reason I like hats is because they're an indicator, a forewarning of sorts of who you are, of who people perceive you to be. So, you know, from the Akubra, which is the wide-brimmed Australian farmer hat, and it's going to be the first entry in my upcoming bestseller, The Dictionary of Hats, and all the way to the very last and humble zucchetto, which is a skull cap worn by Italian clerks. Every hat serves as essentially a display of its owner's profession, specialization, if you will, and status. So essentially, hats are pretty nifty metaphors for professions, and silly hats, the way, you know, the ones I'm going to be wearing throughout this show, they're doubly nifty. So I enjoy silly hats. And so, naturally, since I've dressed up for the talk, I'm not going to talk about any old hats. Instead, what I'd like to talk is about a very specific set of hats worn by a specific set of people. And since there's so many Mac laptops in the audience, I'm going to break into a spontaneous quote from old Apple advertisement and say these people are the misfits, the rebels, the troublemakers, the round pegs in the square holes, or in short, they're the front-end engineers. Now, front-end engineering stands as perhaps a very unique discipline, and unique doesn't need any modifier, so I don't know why I put one there, because a front-end engineer does not wear a hat of a single style. Front-end engineer is a person who wears many hats, and wears each one of them frequently, all the while retaining the memory of the other ones. And so this talk really is about all of these hats, about all of these amazing facets of our profession, and the important qualities and the significances that each of these facets brings to the table. Now, the story I'm about to tell, and I think Eric mentioned that in his otherwise very flattering introduction, is very thin on technical knowledge, but it's rich with food for thought. So in fact, it's kind of an ode to front-end engineering, and it's also an argument that the future of the web, which is arguably the most important communication tool humanity has ever arrived at, probably by accident, that future lies in our ability to successfully combine all of these skills, all of these specializations, which is to say, in our ability to keep track of all of our hats. And so the other thing is that this talk, with the exception of perhaps one issue, is not prescriptive, but rather declarative. I'm just sort of talking about what front-end engineers already do. Front-end engineers have already succeeded and continue to become bigger and bigger players, And so I hope you forgive my immodesty when I'm going to be making these bold pronouncements about front-end engineering. I actually have a good excuse because my own contribution in the big picture are small, and I'm merely standing on all of your shoulders. So I'm just describing your work in my own little poetic way. There we go. That's you holding me up. There we go. So let's get to the hats. That was enough of an introduction. So the first hat we're going to talk about is not this one. I'm going to put this one down right here. The first hat is perhaps the most obvious one, for no other reason than its presence in the name of our profession, and it is the hat of an engineer. Did it break? It didn't break. Oh, that's good enough. All right. It's number one. There we go. Now, there's this crazy astronomer in Berkeley named Clifford Stahl. There he is. And he once said, and do not hold me accountable for this quote because I'm paraphrasing it very roughly, but he said, in human progress, the first pass is when you discover something. That's science. The second pass is when you invent a use for it. That's engineering. And then the third pass is when you keep repeating the same thing over and over. Then you're just a technician. Now, I would say it's rather self-serving of Dr. Stahl to put scientists first, but we as engineers are magnanimous, so we're going to let him pass. But note the distinction, though, that perfecting a technique does not make you an engineer. It is being able to push the boundaries of the existing science and the existing knowledge and find the most creative and functional uses for it that actually gives you that credential. So this hat, this engineer's hat, of all of the engineering disciplines, has the distinction of being incredibly divided and thus requiring an engineer to possess a vast amount of very varying knowledge. So there's your divided hat. And just consider what all the pieces are. There's a markup language for controlling the structure of the output. There's procedural language for implementing functionality and interactivity. There's a layout and attribute language for defining the styles and the appearance. There's a layer for communicating with the network and the servers. And from the talks you've heard earlier today in the morning and the further talks down, if you reasonably assume that the parts of the backend that render the user-facing bits are also part of the front-end engineering discipline, and there's also the server side. And so the workspace for a front-end engineer becomes really quite astounding. Now, consider, too, that these pieces are all multiplied by different dimensions. So how these parts are actually implemented differs from device to device, and from operating system to operating system, and from VM to VM. And so in this really complex multi-dimensional matrix of doom, how do we hold on to our hats? Well, the answer is we pin down our hats with a few rules of thumb. Yeah, you like that? Yeah. I was proud of that one. First, we always clearly define the scope of the problem that we would like to solve. Now, we'll find out where that statement of the problem actually comes from in a minute when we get to a different hat, but without that defining statement, we would actually never know where to dig in the vast space to find the necessary solutions. And so every module, every tool, every utility we produce has to be an answer to a very specific question. And everyone, in order to sort of be part of the engineering discipline, really has to push out the boundaries of the technology it's built on in exactly the right way to achieve its goal. The second rule of thumb, if you will, is that we solve problems universally. We don't tackle just one platform and then lament the fact that our work isn't fit to run on another platform. Because however hostile, these development environments are really all we have. And so our job is really to reach the user and solve his or her problem, not be bitter and jaded about it. And so what we do is we attack complexity with complexity of our own, and what we ultimately achieve in that paradox is simplicity. And that's precisely why all of our projects have to really fill out that scary matrix quite smoothly and run on each device exactly as we intend them to. Now, the third point is that we adhere to standards. Now, standards are not a guarantee by any means, and they aren't always possible to follow, but they are our best hope for interoperability and actually providing the reduction to the size of that horrible matrix of doom. So, if standards aren't available, we resort to conventions. Conventions are really standards on their way to becoming standards. And of course, if neither of those are available, we resort to getting whatever it takes, doing whatever it takes to solve the problem. Now, whatever it takes is not it's not a brutal notion. You have to approach the problem elegantly. And so that's point 4. Our solutions to problems are elegant. Now, the simplicity is an obvious part of that elegance. We have to get to simplicity by tackling these problems across the entire spectrum of possible environments, but that's only part of what allows us to claim elegance. Elegance is a pretty elusive goal, in fact, and it's pretty elusive both for complex problems and for hats. So like this hat is not particularly elegant. But it requires more than just a simple solution. An elegant solution has to be effective. It is very often non-obvious, and it is sometimes and often addresses multiple problems at once. And so the elegance is achieved not just by solving the right problem with the right tools, but by solving it as it best suits the user. Now, we talked about the user, and that's a very good place and a very good segue to jump to the second hat. I'm going to give this hat its rightful place and put on this one. There we go. Is the shtick wearing thin yet? No. And it's the hat of an anthropologist. Now, finish. There we go. A generalist engineer or a back-end engineer may have some very interesting problems to solve, and that's great, but they never really have to deliver their end results directly to the user. So they sort of work with the bits and bytes and they process them in interesting ways, and that's great. But we don't just deal with streams of bits and bytes, we deal with humans, and we deal with them directly. And so because of that, we need to know exactly what it is that the user wants to see. Now, that knowledge is both easy and hard to obtain. On the surface, it is actually pretty easy to just ask the user, well, what do you want? But there are obstacles that stand in our way. That question is not always answered directly, but one of the biggest obstacles is that we need to figure out exactly who our users are. Now, this folk advice that is sort of often given by engineers is that, oh, well, just ask your mother. Well, asking your mother only works if your mother is going to be a direct and frequent user of your project. You really need to ask the users who actually care and who actually are invested in your project and want to see it succeed and are interested in using it. And so engineers who build front-end modules for use by other engineers, they face an even more interesting challenge because what they're building is a system that's like a coin. It has two sides. On one side, there are other engineers who use these systems as building blocks. And on the other side are the end users who actually consume the projects that are built out of these pieces. So this requires us to pay attention to both and to pay attention to the user. And so here's how we do that. First, we do ask the users. You can't get away without asking a user, but we ask these questions intelligently. We don't lead, and we read between the lines, because users very often don't tell you exactly what they want, but they actually imply it. And you have to listen to users very carefully. The second piece is that, well, very often it's hard to go out there and talk to users and do user studies, especially if you're short on time and resources. So instead of asking users directly, it's useful to construct models. Now, there are positive models where we collect the most useful features, And then what we do is we apply the laws of simplicity. Now, most recently, I believe John Maida, who's a great graphic designer and computer scientist, kind of succinctly formulated laws of simplicity. But there are a few that are especially important. The first one is thoughtful reduction. The second is organization. And the third one is savings in time, which is just another word for nailing performance. Now, just as useful as positive models are the negative ones, because instead of constructing a good thing, sometimes it really helps to construct an awful thing by imagining everything that can possibly go wrong. That is actually an exercise in paying attention, because when you only add good things, you often forget to protect yourself from bad things. So what I like to give as an example is constructing a storefront. So how can you construct a storefront where everything is completely wrong? Well, the first thing you can do is display no products. The second thing you can do is lift the door 4 feet off the ground, right push on it, and make it pullable. You get the idea, right? You can do a lot of things to make things go wrong. The third thing we do is we iterate. When front-end engineers design a code base for use by other developers, we comb through the features over and over. We determine whether those features are needed, whether they're of the right quality in many different aspects, whether they adhere to standards. Then we rinse and repeat up until about 10 minutes before the release. When we think about the end user, we think about the interaction design loop by asking over and over, what is the interaction? What is the resulting perception from that interaction? And what did the user learn as the result of that perception? By thinking about that and thinking about how to adjust the perception and learning to make the interaction optimal, we can really improve our projects. Fourth, when we really can't get to the user, we have to rely on sort of this wide database of shared symbols. Let me explain what that means. During the Cold War, when land command centers needed to send messages to submarines that were out on long voyages, they used something called extremely low frequency, which is an actual technical term. It's so low that they actually put in this huge modifier there, extremely low frequency. Now, the problem with extremely low frequency is that it does get messages through the depths of water, but the low frequency results in a very narrow bandwidth. So you couldn't transmit messages very effectively. So instead of transmitting full messages, what was transmitted were symbols. And the submarines on board had a dictionary of these symbols that deciphered back to actual messages. And there was a set of standard messages that were conveyed. Now, human beings, when communicating with each other in non-verbose ways, they rely on similar shared knowledge of symbols. And in UI paradigms, there are many great examples of that. You know, the most obvious ones are arrows, emoticons, and so on, just different symbols. The other half of the audience can look it up when you get home. Now, one has to be very careful because shared semiosis, which is the scientific name for symbol processing, is very frequently culture-specific. So when Richard Nixon flashed the V, he was sure that V stood for victory, while all the while the hippies in San Francisco were sure that it stood for peace. And the two are not frequently commensurate. So you have to be very careful about what symbols you use and how they're perceived. Now, usability always necessarily implies accessibility. We have to strive to create experiences that are as universal as possible and do not expect the user to be a certain way. Much like we do not expect the environment that the user is in to be a certain way. And the important piece to understand here is that accessibility, by comparison to the overall size of the projects we work on, is actually a fairly small piece. But it's a small investment with great returns. The only issue with it is that you have to think of it in the original design. It cannot be an afterthought. You have to incorporate it into your project. But accessibility and usability are completely encompassing each other. Now, usability also necessitates graceful degradation. Now, why is that? I would have come up with a clever explanation, but Mitch Hedberg, a legendary comedian and not at all a usability expert, actually described it best, and so there's no way I could say it better, so I'm just going to quote directly. He said, let me zoom up here, an escalator can never break. It can only become stairs. You would never see escalator temporarily out of order sign, just escalator temporarily stairs. Sorry for the convenience. Now, sorry for the convenience, that is really the distilled essence of usability. And whereas graceful degradation is a usability issue, it is, of course, paralleled by its identical twin, its reverse, the progressive enhancement. The engineers, by building the front-end pieces in a manner that starts with a low-hanging fruit and proceeds to build up layers of functionality, the engineers make the user experience that way central to their work. Now, get that out of you. Now, one could stop at these two hats. There they are, just to remind you. Engineer, anthropologist. The hat of an engineer, the hat of an anthropologist are great, but then one would not be a front-end engineer. And also, this talk would be too short. So, let me take this one off. And put on a third hat. And that is the hat of an artist. I like this one. All right. Now, in many companies, present company included, did you see what I just did there? The visual designer, the artist, is most often completely separated away from the engineer. In fact, they aren't just separated away, they're standing on two sides of a very deep canyon, and they're throwing specs and mock-ups at each other, barely able to hide their contempt. Now, this has to stop, and though this is not, by and large, the case now, this is the one place where I'm getting prescriptive. This is an argument for the future. Now, here's the problem with separating them. A poem or a beautiful painting or a great sculpture can stand completely on their own. But the aesthetics of a website, of a front-end application, of user-facing content are very heavily tied to their usability. The use of color and space, typography and grids, layouts, building structures that are receptive to both graceful degradation and thoughtful navigation, all of those things require the artist to understand the project's usability at a very deep level. But the very same usability, the elegance and the simplicity are inextricably tied to functionality, and that's the piece that the engineer is responsible for. And so the front-end engineers will eventually have to adopt the artist's hats and build a sort of a bridge across that chasm. And just to think about it, great visual design is not somehow magically restricted to people who majored in humanities. And if engineers included in their lineup of skills, the design of future front ends will be in much better alignment with their function. And so we've actually spent some time sort of combining the engineering and the design resources for the new YUI site. And on Tuesday night, like Eric mentioned, we'll be showing off some of our humble efforts. And you're welcome to take a look. And so here's an engineer adopting the artist's hat. And there's a little macabre humor for you. Now, these are the three major hats: engineer, anthropologist, and artist. But there are a few slightly smaller hats which are just as important. So let's give the artist his spot, her spot. A little slimy. and move on to the next hat. And this one is the hat of a writer. Now, I had no idea what hats writers wear, so I went on a little research mission, and the very first person I encountered was Arthur Conan Doyle, and he wore this wonderful bowler hat, and so I just adapted it. But I think there's no standard for writers. They apparently don't have a hat. Well, engineers without users only have to comment their code so that they can remember what it is they did, right? So we get things like this. Now, some engineers I see walking around campus even have T-shirts that say, "Document my code. Why do you think we call it code?" The problem is that an engineer with a user, even if that user is another engineer, needs to thoroughly document his work, and in more ways than one. Because if you don't, this is what you're going to get. In this process of documenting your work, of adding comments to your code, of drawing diagrams, of making screencasts, of running conferences, actually happens to be incredibly beneficial and doesn't just make the product simpler and easier to learn, but it also helps the engineer to test and put on the hat of the user. In fact, there's even, in certain software development circles, kind of the reverse approach to development, where you document first, you write tests second, and only then you implement. We don't tend to do that, but it's certainly an approach that has its merits. And documentation is also about effective communication. Front-end engineers spend weeks of development time on examples, API docs, forum posts, because explaining these concepts and facts to others gives those people more incentive to use them, but it also gives us a much greater insight into our own work. When we teach others, we definitely learn from it. And that is the greatest advantage to being a great communicator when you're an engineer. And to do that, you have to practice. It doesn't come for free. You have to go through the iterations of being able to do that. Now, I mentioned inside, and there's one more hat on the table. And I will take this one down and give it its seed. And that's the hat of a paranoid. Now, those who are from Yahoo would know what this word means. But this strange name is what we actually call security specialists at Yahoo. But the front engineers face a unique predicament because each one of us has to be a security specialist as well. So let's draw in all the hats we have so far. And add the security specialist hat. There we go. Now, why do we all have to be security specialists and understand how the security works and spend a lot of time on it? Well, consider the predicament. We are sending the code to the end user to execute on their machine, but it's being executed in an environment we have no knowledge about. We don't know what the environment is, what's going on there. We're sending the code uncompiled, completely unhidden, with nothing left to the imagination. And so, in a situation like this, there's really not a sandbox big enough in the universe to contain all the dangers. And so we have to address security. The way we address security is by, first and foremost, reviewing each other's code. We have to look for specific patterns of communication that may lead to security issues. And always have to remember that security is not just about compromising the user's data. It is also about user's experience. If the user's experience has been compromised in any way with a memory leak, or an infinite loop, or an uncontrollable UI, that isn't just a usability failure. That is a security failure. And these are the very essential ways to address security. You have to test, you have to review, and most importantly, if there's a failure, you have to correct. You have to correct, and you have to apologize. Now, In YUI2, like you've heard, we recently had a breakdown in security that we had to fix. And so even the most thorough review processes sometimes miss the target. And wearing the corrector's hat and the apologist's hat even once is more often than anybody would like to, but it has to be done. But those are the sad parts. So we're not going to talk about them much longer. So I'll draw a line there. And let's talk about fun things, because there's one more hat to try on. And that's the hat I was wearing all along. And that's the hat of what I call a futurist. Now, a real futurist is a person who constantly questions their need for their own existence in the future. Fake futurists don't actually do that, because if they actually questioned the need for themselves in the future, they'd get depressed over how useless they are. And so we can put on the futurist hat and ask, why are we, the front-end engineers, such a big deal? Why is that front engineering is so important? And here's why. Front-end engineers are guardians of effective communication. To the user, the product that they see is not just the amazing and efficient algorithm that's running on the co-located server somewhere in the middle of the country. It is the presentation of that product, the interaction between the human and the computer. Building that interaction is very often much more challenging of a feat than creating the right backend, because it too requires amazing algorithms. But like we said, it requires those amazing algorithms to be implemented in limited resources with unknown hardware, and they're much harder to get right because the metrics for these things are often qualitative rather than quantitative. And we happen to be the authors of these interactions. And that's why the ultimate front-end engineer must be a humanist technologist, which is a technologist that creates not because he's capable of creating, but because he actually cares. And that is why front-end engineers, more than anyone, have driven the open source movement. Because, well, of course, this originated from the fact that our code is so hard to hide, but we did a lot with that notion. It is because our work targets human beings directly that we make it open, because opening it up invites participation of other engineers, it boosts quality, boosts transparency, and it keeps us honest. And so as long as we're able to juggle all of these hats, and as long as we stay committed to this openness and this transparency, this humanist approach to technology, which is a uniquely ours approach to technology, it's actually indistinguishable from magic. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your point of view, this is all I have. So here's my hat, and we're not in a hurry. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, questions if you have any, or just your own meditations on these many roles of front-end engineers.
I was going to ask you to draw something, but now I won't.
Yes.
So, hiring front-end engineers, how much does that suck? I mean, kind of rhetorical, really, because I've had to do it a few times, and it's just the most painful process.
Right.
From looking at the resumes and seeing what kind of buzzword bingo they're playing, and
Right.
actually figuring out what kind of questions you ask. I mean, do you see any sort of standardization of that skill set, or is it always going to be this kind of, you have to be a self-starter learner because it's always changing and kind of...
Well, I think it takes time, and I think a lot depends on what background are people coming from into the profession, because as young as it is, there are a lot of people who are transitioning, from, like I said, from being an artist to being an engineer and sort of acquiring these engineering skills in work. And so that's potentially difficult, and there might be an engineer who is sort of transferring from back end to front end. So I don't think there's a clear-cut sort of direction for someone to become a front end engineer yet. But I would say in recent months, you can't really. I guess you could talk about it on the scale of years, but in recent times, you see kind of a more consistent standard of quality. And I think it's based just on the fact that people are gaining so much more experience.
Yeah, and like in the last year, I mean, compared to 2 years ago, it was much harder. Last year, it was hard because everyone who was coming from the design angle had like jQuery.
Right.
And that's it.
Right.
And we're like, okay, how do you do a loop in JavaScript? And they didn't know how to do that.
Right.
So, I mean, that's kind of depressing.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly don't have an easy time finding great front-end engineers, and when we have, we hold on to them with both hands because they are difficult to find. Yeah.
How do you feel about the role of a front-end engineer as a mediator between the person who's doing the comps, the person who's providing the back end, possibly marketing who wants the logo bigger? Do you have any comments on that role? It's kind of, different hats for different people and your position within that organization, that structure?
Well, I think the real issue is that when you hand off a hat to a different person without them having a clear knowledge of your project, you're very often going to run into issues where they just don't quite get all of the requirements, and that's problematic. I mean, you could effectively mediate that by sharing the information very aggressively. But that takes up a lot of extra time. I'm really very much for that one person being a multidisciplinary guru, and that makes it that much harder to find. People who sort of cover all of the bases. But I think it's much more effective and much more productive when it's that one person doing many things. All right. Well, I'll be happy to talk to folks individually afterwards, and thank you for coming.